In the 1970s, the American Farm Belt became the stage for a high-horsepower arms race, one that pushed manufacturers to chase bigger, louder, and more aggressive machines with unprecedented speed. But behind the polished brochures and bold promises, one engine was hiding a flaw so dangerous it would leave fields silent, dealers overwhelmed, and a company scrambling to protect its reputation. Farmers believed they were buying the future of agriculture. Instead, many found themselves stranded in their own fields, facing failures no one would admit existed. This is the untold story of how a single rushed decision ignited a crisis that shook an entire industry and nearly destroyed the giant behind it. The horsepower war that forced IH into a corner. The American Farm Belt of the early 1970s wasn't just a patchwork of fields and fence lines. It was becoming something far louder, far more competitive, and far more unforgiving. Out in those vast stretches of corn, wheat, and soybean country, the ground shook not from storms or passing freight trains, but from machinery that seemed to grow bigger, heavier, and more aggressive every single year. What had once been a quiet rivalry between tractor companies was turning into a full-blown arms race, and every farmer, every dealership, and every manufacturer knew exactly what was at stake. The era was changing. Farms were expanding, and the companies who failed to keep up weren't just risking sales. They were risking their entire future. By 1972, the battle lines were clear. John Deere had thrown the first major punch with the 6030, a monster of a machine that didn't just push past the 175 horsepower mark, it obliterated expectations about what a farm tractor could do. That single model sparked a nationwide demand for raw, unapologetic power, the kind of strength that could pull deeper, run longer, and tear through fields faster than anything that had come before. And for farmers suddenly facing rising land prices, shrinking labor pools, and pressure to produce more from every acre, that power wasn't a luxury, it was survival. International Harvester saw all of it unfolding from inside its Chicago headquarters, and the pressure hit the company with a force it wasn't ready for. IH wasn't a small player. It was one of the most iconic names in American agriculture. But Deere's move had landed harder than anyone wanted to admit. IH dealerships across the Midwest began reporting the same uncomfortable trend. Longtime loyalists, farmers whose barns had been red for generations, were stopping to look across the fence. Not at a competitor, at a threat. At a green tractor with horsepower numbers IH no longer had an answer for. Inside the company, the tension grew thick. Engineers were being pushed harder, deadlines squeezed tighter, and every conversation circled the same question: how fast could IH respond? Farms were getting larger every year, sometimes doubling in size, and those expanding operations needed pulling power that IH simply didn't offer at the scale Deere had just unleashed. The risk was brutally simple. If IH couldn't counter the 6030 quickly and convincingly, it wouldn't just lose a sale, it would lose an entire generation of farmers to a rival that wasn't slowing down. Brand loyalty in rural America wasn't just a preference, it was practically a family identity. The color of your tractor said something about who you were and how your father farmed. A switch from red to green wasn't casual, it was almost scandalous. But as Deere surged ahead, that switch was becoming more common. IH executives knew what every lost loyalist really meant. A lost buyer of implements, a lost customer for parts, and a lost future fleet. So when the pressure finally cracked the corporate calm, the decision came swiftly and, to some, recklessly. IH wouldn't just match Deere. They would build something that could challenge the entire high-horsepower category. Something that would prove the company was still a titan, still a fierce competitor, and still capable of dominating America's largest farms. And to do it, they needed a new engine. Not a refinement, not a revision, but a centerpiece. a power plant that could anchor their comeback. The marching orders from upper management were blunt. Build it fast, build it powerful, and don't let Deere control the narrative for another season. Engineers at IH knew what that meant. There was no time for careful evolution, no room for slow testing cycles, and no opportunity to gather long-term field data. The market wouldn't wait, dealers wouldn't wait, and farmers, tempted by the lure of bigger, louder machines, weren't waiting either. And that was the moment the company made the decision that would shape everything that followed. IH committed to a new diesel platform they believed would drag them back into the fight and restore confidence among the farmers they were desperate to keep. That engine would become known as the DT-466, a name that would one day be spoken with respect, but only after surviving a chapter of chaos few outside the farming world ever fully understood. Because before the DT-466 became anything reliable, it first became something else entirely. A rushed, overpressured, heavily marketed gamble born in the shadow of a horsepower war IH was terrified of losing. And hidden inside that gamble was a fatal flaw, one that would soon erupt into one of the most disruptive mechanical failures the Farm Belt had seen in years. Birth of a giant, IH rushes the DT-466 into the fight. The decision to build a new diesel engine should have been a slow, methodical process. Months of calculations, years of testing, and countless hours spent listening to what farmers actually needed. But in the early 1970s, International Harvester didn't have the luxury of time or caution. The pressure created by Deere's 6030 wasn't just hanging over the company, it was suffocating it. Inside IH's engineering buildings in Melrose Park, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Meetings grew sharper, deadlines grew shorter, and upper management repeated the same mantra with increasing urgency. We need power, and we need it now. What followed didn't resemble a typical engine development cycle. It felt more like a factory on fire, everyone running in different directions, each department racing to put out problems while senior leadership poured gasoline in the form of impossible expectations. IH needed a new power plant for its upcoming high-horsepower tractors, and they needed it rushed through design and testing at a pace that made seasoned engineers uneasy. The DT-466 wasn't born out of inspiration. It was born out of fear. Engineers had already been conceptualizing a new mid-range diesel series, something durable that could replace aging designs from the 1950s and 60s. But none of those early sketches were meant to be pushed into production this quickly. When management demanded the project be fast-tracked, the engineers were handed a brutal challenge. Take a promising foundation and turn it into a battlefield-ready powerhouse in record time. The team responded, but many quietly warned that the timeline was unrealistic, the testing windows too small, and the margins for error dangerously thin. Still, the company pushed ahead. The new block would be large and cast from thick iron, a backbone meant to prove IH still understood heavy-duty engineering. It would feature wet sleeves for serviceability, a modern fuel system for efficiency, and a rotating assembly designed, at least on paper, to handle serious torque. But the biggest decision, the one that would define the engine's early life, was made not by engineers but by executives. The DT-466 would enter the market turbocharged right out of the gate. That single choice shifted the entire project. Turbocharging wasn't new, but pushing a brand new platform to high boost levels without extensive field testing was a gamble no cautious company would normally take. But IH wasn't operating cautiously. They were operating reactively, desperate to reclaim ground lost to Deere. The order was simple: turn up the power, turn up the fuel, and make sure the spec sheet looked competitive. Concerns about long-term durability would be dealt with later. Inside the engineering rooms, frustration simmered. Some argued that the bottom end needed strengthening. Others insisted the oiling system required upgrades for sustained heavy loads. and a few warned that without real field hours, IH couldn't possibly predict how the new engine would behave. Every warning was met with the same response: "We don't have time." The horsepower war allowed no second guesses. Meanwhile, the marketing department prepared to introduce the DT-466 as a breakthrough, an engine so advanced it would redefine IH's place in the tractor world. Brochures were drafted, talking points written, and prototype tractors were showcased with promises that outpaced what engineers had actually verified. Publicly, the DT-466 was a triumph. Privately, it was an uncertainty. The rush to production pushed the engine through testing cycles that normally took months and squeezed them into weeks. Early test units ran hot under heavy loads. Some developed troubling lower-end vibration. Others showed bearing wear sooner than expected. Under normal circumstances, these results would have triggered redesigns and more testing. But the clock was ticking. Dealers were demanding machines, and executives insisted the engine was close enough. So the DT-466 moved forward, imperfect, unproven, and propelled by urgency. Factories began casting blocks, machining cranks, assembling rotating assemblies, and shipping early units to tractor plants before engineers ever felt confident in the design. The tractors slated to debut with the new engine were already behind schedule, already over budget, and already expected to perform at levels IH had never tested long-term. When International Harvester finally rolled out its new high-horsepower tractors with the DT-466 under the hood, there was genuine excitement. Farmers saw a modern engine. Dealers saw a long-awaited counterpunch to Deere. Executives saw a lifeline. But beneath the optimism and the roar of the turbocharger, the flaw remained. A weakness buried deep inside the rotating assembly, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And it wouldn't take long. Turbo trouble, the moment. Everything started to crack. When the first production DT-466 engines rolled out of Melrose Park and into the new generation of IH tractors, the excitement was real. Farmers fired them up and heard the sharp whistle of the turbocharger spooling, a sound that felt like a promise. Raw strength, modern engineering, and the kind of power International Harvester claimed would return them to the top of the horsepower race. On paper, everything looked right. The numbers were competitive, the torque curves were impressive, and the marketing made it seem as if IH had finally found its answer to Deere's rising dominance. But beneath that confident roar, buried inside the rotating assembly, something else was happening. The turbocharger wasn't just adding power, it was adding pressure. Pressure the engine's bottom end simply wasn't prepared to handle. The trouble began quietly. Farmers pulling heavy implements noticed the engines ran hotter than expected when the boost climbed under load. Mechanics doing routine checks found oil temperatures higher than normal and bearings showing early stress. None of these issues alone sounded catastrophic, but together they hinted at a deeper problem. The turbocharger was forcing air into the cylinders faster than the engine's internal design could safely manage, raising combustion temperatures and cylinder pressures far beyond what the unproven bottom end had ever been tested for. Inside IH's engineering offices, a few recognized the warnings immediately. Turbocharged engines demanded robust internal architecture, strong crankshafts, durable bearings, aggressive oil flow, and cooling systems capable of taming the heat created under sustained load. But the DT-466 had not been given the full suite of reinforcements needed for a high-boost configuration. It had been rushed out the door long before engineers could understand its real limits. Once the tractors hit the field, those limits revealed themselves faster than anyone anticipated. The first major complaints came from farmers pulling large tillage equipment, forcing the engine to remain in high boost for hours. Under that stress, the crankshaft, already operating near the edge of its design, began forming microscopic fatigue cracks. These were subtle at first but grew with every hard pull. The main bearing struggled too, starved of cooling and lubrication during heavy load cycles. The oiling system, never redesigned to match the aggressive turbo tuning, couldn't keep up. When those components weakened, the failures were violent. Some engines developed a hard knock moments before the crankshaft snapped. Others seized without warning as bearings overheated and welded themselves together. In severe cases, pistons scuffed cylinder walls, melted under extreme temperatures, or cracked as exhaust gas temperatures climbed far beyond safe limits. Farmers who had invested heavily in what IH promised was a modern, high-performance machine suddenly found themselves stranded in their own fields, surrounded by silence where the roar of a new engine should have been. For many, these breakdowns weren't just mechanical. They were financial crises. Planting windows closed quickly. Harvest schedules left no room for downtime. In agriculture, nature doesn't wait for repairs. Dealers were soon overwhelmed. Service bays filled with tractors showing the same symptoms: failed bearings, twisted crankshafts, burned pistons, and oil systems that had simply surrendered under sustained boost. Mechanics who had spent years repairing reliable IH engines were stunned by how fast the new ones fell apart. Some began calling the early turbocharged DT-466 models time bombs, not out of exaggeration but out of frustration. They were rebuilding engines with fewer than 300 hours on them. IH headquarters tried to downplay the crisis. Official statements blamed misuse, improper maintenance, or operator adjustments to the injection pump. And while a few farmers did turn their pumps up, many didn't. Many ran the engine exactly as IH intended. The failures weren't caused by abuse. They were caused by a design pushed too hard, too fast, by a company desperate to catch up. Inside the engineering department, anger brewed quietly. The warnings they had raised months earlier were now unfolding across hundreds of farms. The bottom end needed strengthening. The oiling system needed upgrades. The turbocharger needed proper cooling, but it was too late. The tractors were already in the field. The engines were failing, and the damage was spreading. The moment the turbocharger was forced into the design without proper reinforcement was the moment everything started to crack. Figuratively at first, and then literally inside engines all across the Midwest. And the wave of failures was only beginning. Engines exploding in the field. The failure wave. By the mid-1970s, the first wave of DT-466 failures was no longer a whisper traded between mechanics in dealership back rooms. It had become a full-blown crisis unfolding across farms from Iowa to Indiana. The tractors that IH had promoted as the future of high-horsepower agriculture were now limping, knocking, overheating, or simply dying under workloads they were supposedly built to handle. At first, dealers tried to treat the failures as isolated incidents, the sort of bad luck every manufacturer experiences. But within months, the pattern grew impossible to ignore. These engines weren't failing randomly. They were failing the same way, under the same conditions, and at shockingly low hours. Catastrophic failures almost always began under heavy load. A farmer would hook up a deep ripper or a chisel plow, drop it into the ground, and let the tractor dig in. For the first hour or two, everything seemed normal. The turbo whistled, the inline six pulled hard, and the tractor felt every bit as strong as IH had promised. But as the boost stayed high and temperatures climbed, something inside the engine would start to complain. A faint metallic tick, a shift in exhaust note, a vibration that didn't match the cadence of a healthy bottom end. Then came the final warning, a deep, heavy knock echoing through the cab like metal striking metal. What happened afterward depended on which component failed first. Some farmers heard a single, violent bang, so loud it sounded like a gunshot, before the tractor coasted to a stop. Others said the engine shuddered once, made a grinding sound, and instantly died. The root cause was nearly always the same. The crankshaft had snapped. When it broke, it didn't break neatly. It took out the main bearings, the oil pump, and often shattered the lower block, leaving jagged holes in the casting and oil splattered across the soil. Other engines didn't explode. They melted. Bearings overheated until they welded themselves to the crank. Pistons seized inside their sleeves, locking the engine solid. Cylinder walls cracked under the strain of temperatures far beyond safe limits, and with overheated oil thinning out, the rotating assembly simply tore itself apart. What IH engineers feared during rushed testing was now happening under real farm workloads. Day after day, field after field, dealerships felt the surge of failures immediately. Service bays that usually handled predictable seasonal repairs suddenly overflowed year-round. Mechanics pulled pan after pan and found the same heartbreaking story. Bearings blackened by heat, crankshafts scored or fractured, pistons burned at the crown, and oil thick with metal. Engines that should have run thousands of hours looked ruined before they reached 300. Farmers didn't stay quiet about their frustration. They couldn't. A dead tractor during harvest wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat to their livelihood. Fields sat untouched while engines waited on back-ordered parts. Grain quality suffered as harvest windows narrowed. Some farmers were forced to rent equipment they couldn't afford just to save their crops. For many, the new IH tractor they'd stretched their finances to buy had become an unpredictable liability. What made the failures even more devastating was how suddenly they struck. One farmer in Iowa said his tractor seized so abruptly while climbing a simple slope that it threw him forward in the seat. Mechanics found a main bearing shattered into fragments. Another farmer in Nebraska said his tractor ran perfectly the day before. The next morning, it started with a grinding sound that lasted seconds before the engine locked up. Across the Midwest, IH technicians noticed the same pattern. The engines failing were almost always the ones working hardest, the ones running sustained boost, pulling deep, or handling heavy implements. In other words, the engines were failing exactly when used as IH intended. Farmers weren't abusing their equipment. They were trusting the promises printed in IH's brochures. As the failure wave grew, so did the resentment. Some customers demanded full warranty replacements. Others accused dealers of hiding the truth. A few families who had bought red tractors for generations, people whose barns had been IH red since the 1940s, walked into dealerships and asked about green machines instead. The trust IH had spent decades earning was beginning to fracture, just like the crankshafts inside its newest engine. And for International Harvester, the most alarming part wasn't the broken machinery. It was the speed at which the crisis was growing. Engines were failing faster than IH could explain them, faster than dealers could repair them, and faster than engineers could diagnose the root cause. The failure wave had moved beyond mechanics. It was becoming a company-wide disaster, and the worst consequences were still approaching. The farmer revolt, broken trust, broken machines. By the time the DT-466 failures became impossible to hide, something far more dangerous than broken engines was beginning to spread across the Farm Belt: resentment. Farmers who had once sworn by International Harvester now found themselves staring at machines they no longer trusted, machines that had betrayed them at the worst possible moments, and machines that IH insisted should have been strong enough to handle the very work that destroyed them. What began as frustration soon evolved into something sharper. A quiet revolt was taking shape across rural America, and the anger wasn't just directed at the tractors. It was aimed squarely at the company behind them. Farmers talk. At grain elevators, coffee shops, auction barns, and diner counters, the same stories were being told again and again. A man in Illinois would describe how his tractor snapped a crankshaft in the middle of planting. Someone from Missouri would jump in, saying theirs seized during harvest. A farmer from Wisconsin would mention how his dealer had 3 identical failures in the shop that same week. The details were different, but the ending was always the same. The engine, IH's newest, most modern diesel, had failed long before it should have. And once those stories spread far enough, the tone of the conversations changed. Farmers were no longer asking whether the DT-466 had a problem. They were asking whether International Harvester had knowingly sold them a machine that wasn't ready for the field. The sense of betrayal cut deep. For generations, IH had built its reputation on reliability. The company's earlier tractors were known for taking abuse, working long hours, and surviving conditions that would break lesser machines. Families passed their red tractors down like heirlooms, confident they were investing in something built to last. So when the DT-466 began failing at a pace no one had ever seen before, it felt personal, almost like a breach of faith. Dealerships suddenly found themselves caught between two fires. On one side were their longtime customers, neighbors, friends, members of the same church or local co-op, coming in furious, demanding answers that dealers didn't have. On the other side was International Harvester, insisting that the failures were isolated, that customers must be overworking their machines, or that the engines were suffering from improper maintenance. It didn't matter that some failures happened at 150 hours, or that some tractors were still on their first oil change. The official line from IH was firm. The engines weren't defective. That denial poured gasoline on the anger already growing in the countryside. A farmer dealing with a snapped crankshaft could stomach the repair bill, as painful as it was, but being told it was his fault, that he misused the tractor he bought in good faith, was something else entirely. It felt like an insult layered on top of an injury. And farmers, as IH would soon learn, do not forget insults. Some tried to stay loyal at first. They went back to their dealers again and again, repairing the engines, adjusting the pumps, installing upgraded bearings or cooling systems. But as more failures appeared, their patience ran out. IH hadn't just sold them an unreliable machine, it had sold them a problem disguised as progress. Every time a tractor broke down in the middle of planting or harvest, every time a crankshaft snapped, every time a dealer sighed and said parts were on back order, it pushed more farmers to the breaking point. And when farmers revolt, it isn't loud. It's quiet, decisive, and devastating. Some began trading their IH tractors in for Deere models, even if it meant taking a financial hit. Others stopped buying IH implements or parts altogether. A few who had once bought exclusively red equipment started mixing colors in their fleet, using IH only for lighter work to avoid risking another catastrophic failure. The loyalty that had defined rural American agriculture for decades was starting to crumble. It didn't help that many farmers felt IH was hiding something. The consistency of the failures, the similar damage patterns, the repeated symptoms, it all pointed to a design flaw. So why wouldn't the company admit it? Why were farmers being blamed for pushing an engine that IH marketed as powerful enough to handle exactly that work? The distrust grew so strong that in some towns, farmers began warning each other away from the DT-466 entirely. Older IH mechanics, men who had spent their careers defending the brand, found themselves quietly advising customers to be cautious. Some even refused to tune up injection pumps on newer models, afraid the added stress would lead to another disaster. IH's reputation wasn't just faltering, it was collapsing. And for the first time in decades, many farmers realized something painful. The company they had trusted for generations was no longer listening. They felt abandoned by the brand they had supported their entire lives. The revolt wasn't sudden, and it wasn't violent, but it was unmistakable. Across the Midwest, barns that had once been proudly red were turning green, orange, or anything else farmers believed they could rely on. International Harvester had lost more than an engine. It had lost the trust that once held the company together, and winning that back would prove far harder than building any tractor. The secret fixes, farmers and mechanics fight back. By the time the DT-466 crisis was fully visible, and fields across the Midwest were dotted with sidelined tractors waiting on parts that always seemed to be a week out, a hard truth had settled over the farming community. If International Harvester wasn't going to fix the problem, the people who depended on these engines to feed their families would have to fix it themselves. In rural America, where self-reliance isn't idealism but survival, Farmers and small-town mechanics began working quietly, methodically, and with a determination born from necessity rather than frustration. What started as scattered complaints soon evolved into an underground engineering effort, a network of men comparing failures, sharing discoveries, and doing what IH refused to do: figure out why these engines were dying far too young and how to keep them alive long enough to finish another season. Repair shops became the front line of this improvised war. Mechanics tore down engine after engine, lining up scorched bearings, cracked crankshafts, and seized pistons like forensic evidence. The metal told the truth plainly. The bottom end was overstressed. The bearings overheated long before they should have. The oiling system couldn't sustain lubrication under heavy load, and the turbocharged boost levels were pushing cylinder pressures far beyond what the rushed platform could safely withstand. It didn't take long before these mechanics stopped waiting for IH engineers to acknowledge their mistake and began crafting their own solutions. The first unofficial fix spreading across farm country was deceptively simple: detune the injection pump. Backing off fuel delivery even a few millimeters dramatically reduced stress on the engine. Power dipped slightly, but reliability rose immediately. Word traveled quietly, from parts counters to diner booths, shared between neighbors leaning on pickup tailgates. "Back it off," they said, "and it won't tear itself apart." Others turned their attention to the turbocharger, swapping the factory unit for smaller, slower spooling versions that built boost more gently and spared the crankshaft from violent pressure spikes. A few added pyrometers borrowed from heavy-duty truck suppliers, giving real-time exhaust temperature readings IH never provided, and warning operators when to ease off before conditions turned destructive. None of these fixes were in the manuals. None came from IH. They came from farmers refusing to let a flawed engine ruin their livelihood. But the most ambitious solutions emerged from machine shops, where mechanics understood that if the engine's weaknesses weren't being addressed at the factory, they would have to strengthen the engine themselves. A machinist in Indiana began reworking crankshafts with larger radiuses around critical stress points, reinforcing the exact areas where so many had snapped. A mechanic in Nebraska sourced upgraded bearings made from more durable alloys designed for harsher industrial environments. For farmers who had already endured catastrophic failures, these upgrades felt less like modifications and more like insurance. In Minnesota, the Peterson family became local legends after suffering 2 DT-466 failures in the same tractor and deciding they were done waiting for IH. They rebuilt the engine with stronger bearings, improved oil passages, and a conservative turbo setup. Work their neighbors mocked until the tractor logged more than 12,000 trouble-free hours, far outlasting untouched engines from the same era. Fixes like these rippled across the region. Some farmers bolted on external oil coolers scavenged from old trucks to help the overstressed lubrication system survive long days of heavy pulling. Others fabricated homemade heat shields to protect the bottom end from temperatures IH had clearly underestimated. A few ambitious mechanics retrofitted intercoolers from completely different engines to cool intake air and reduce thermal strain. None of these solutions were official, polished, or approved, but they worked well enough to keep fields moving. Meanwhile, IH discouraged such modifications, insisting their engines were reliable when used as intended, a claim farmers who had torn down their own engines knew was wishful at best. In the end, the DT-466 wasn't being saved by the engineers who designed it, or the executives who rushed it into production. It was being saved by the ingenuity, stubbornness, and relentless problem-solving of the farmers and mechanics who refused to let a flawed engine dictate their harvest. They rebuilt, reinforced, retuned, and reimagined the machine until it behaved the way IH had promised from the beginning. Yet, as these fixes spread and engines began lasting longer, another realization took hold across the countryside. If the people who bought the machines had to repair the company's mistakes themselves, then perhaps International Harvester no longer deserved the loyalty it had relied on for generations. And that realization was the one wound the company would never fully recover from. Corporate denial. IH refuses to admit the real problem. By the time engines across the Midwest were failing in patterns too obvious to ignore, and dealerships were flooded with tractors awaiting rebuilds that arrived in endless waves, International Harvester found itself face to face with a crisis it could no longer outrun. Yet, instead of confronting the issue head-on, the company retreated behind a wall of corporate messaging, selective data, and carefully crafted statements meant to soften the disaster without ever acknowledging the mechanical flaw at its center. Inside IH's headquarters in Chicago, meetings grew tense as field reports stacked on desks, each detailing another snapped crankshaft, another set of burned bearings, another farmer angry enough to threaten switching brands. But rather than see these reports as evidence of a fundamental engineering failure, executives convinced themselves and tried to convince everyone else that what they were witnessing was the result of misuse, overwork, or improper maintenance. It was easier to blame the customer than admit the company had rushed an engine into the field that was never ready for the punishment it was marketed to withstand. This denial didn't stem from ignorance. IH engineers had warned early that the DT-466's bottom end needed stronger bearings, improved oiling, and more robust crankshaft reinforcement before it could survive the horsepower war. But engineering caution didn't align with sales targets, and by the time fields were full of broken machines, the company's pride had fused itself to the product. Admitting a flaw would mean recalling tractors IH couldn't afford to fix, honoring warranties the company didn't have the budget to cover, and handing ammunition to competitors who were already hunting for weaknesses. So IH doubled down, telling dealers the engines were fine, insisting the failures were isolated, and instructing them to educate customers on proper operation, a sanitized phrase that essentially accused farmers of breaking their own machines. The irony was obvious. These engines were failing while doing exactly what IH claimed they were designed to do. Dealerships became unwilling shields, absorbing the anger IH pretended didn't exist. Service managers watched the same symptoms appear again and again. Crankshafts cracked in the same places, bearings cooked the same way, pistons seized under the same conditions. Yet, when they reported these patterns upward, IH responded with the same refrain. The engine wasn't the problem. The operator was. The company insisted customers were pulling too much load, running too hot, turning up pumps, or neglecting maintenance. Some dealers pushed back, pointing out that engines failing under 300 hours could not reasonably be blamed on poor upkeep. But IH held its position, not because it was accurate, but because admitting the truth meant admitting catastrophe. This refusal to acknowledge reality created a disconnect deeper than any mechanical failure. Farmers who had grown up trusting the brand, whose fathers and grandfathers had relied on IH machinery through droughts, wars, and hard seasons, now found themselves being told they were the problem. Instead of apologies or solutions, they received excuses. Instead of improved parts or revised components, they were handed pamphlets on proper operation. Instead of hearing responsibility, they heard deflection. The trust built over generations began to crumble. Not because the engines were failing, but because the company refused to admit they were failing for reasons no farmer could control. Inside IH's engineering department, resentment simmered. The people who had designed the platform knew where the weaknesses were. They had written the memos, flagged the risks, and raised the alarms. But their warnings collided with marketing promises and corporate pride. The horsepower war had pushed IH to move faster than engineering discipline allowed. And instead of stepping back, the company chose to deny the very evidence piling up in its own shops. Some engineers quietly updated internal documents, outlining the changes needed for future revisions. Stronger crankshafts, wider bearings, improved oil passages, but they knew these upgrades would arrive too late to help the farmers facing failures now. Meanwhile, the crisis outside intensified. Dealers begged for support, farmers demanded answers. Competitors seized the moment, offering reliable alternatives to frustrated customers. And through it all, IH clung to its narrative. Nothing wrong with the design, nothing wrong with the engine, nothing wrong with the company. The message stayed consistent, even as the truth beneath it collapsed. When a corporation refuses to acknowledge a problem that everyone else can plainly see, it creates a breach of trust far more damaging than any mechanical defect. And as the DT-466 failures continued to spread, that breach widened into a gulf that threatened not just customer loyalty, but the company's very stability. Collapse of trust. How one engine nearly broke the company. By the time the DT-466 crisis reached its breaking point, International Harvester was no longer facing a mechanical issue. It was facing something far more damaging, an erosion of trust so deep and so widespread that no amount of public relations, dealership smoothing, or carefully scripted statements could repair it. The mechanical failures had been painful and costly, but what followed, IH's refusal to acknowledge the problem, its insistence on blaming farmers, and its denial of a flaw that was obvious in every service bay, cut into the very identity of the company. A brand, once synonymous with reliability, now carried an air of suspicion and frustration. Farmers didn't just lose confidence in a single engine, they began losing confidence in International Harvester as a whole. For generations, IH had been more than a manufacturer. It was a partner in the unpredictable labor of American agriculture, a symbol of durability, a constant in an industry shaped by weather, prices, and changing technology. When farmers bought Red equipment, they believed they were investing in machines built to survive decades of hard work. But the DT-466 failures shattered that belief. When tractors died in the middle of planting, when harvests stalled because parts were back-ordered, when engines seized under 300 hours and IH insisted everything was fine, farmers felt betrayed. They had trusted IH with their livelihoods, and the company behaved as if that trust was irrelevant. Dealerships absorbed the brunt of the backlash. Customers who had once walked through the door with easy familiarity now arrived tense, impatient, and demanding answers no dealer could honestly give. Families who had purchased IH equipment for decades wanted proof their new tractors weren't simply waiting to fail. Some dealers tried goodwill repairs or absorbed labor costs to ease frustrations, but even extraordinary service couldn't compensate for a factory unwilling to admit the core issue. Relationships between farmers and dealers, relationships built over generations, began to strain under the weight of failures neither side could control. Despite IH's public insistence that nothing was wrong, the market told the truth. Sales of high-horsepower tractors declined steadily, then sharply. Farmers who once refused to consider anything but Red machinery found themselves standing in John Deere showrooms with serious intentions. Others shifted to Alice Chalmers or White, choosing consistency over loyalty. Trade-ins that had once filled H lots with older Red tractors being exchanged for newer models were replaced with quiet departures, as farmers decided they could no longer risk buying from a company that seemed unwilling to take responsibility. Each lost sale was not just a financial setback, it was a statement of lost faith. Inside IH's upper offices, the financial strain became impossible to ignore. Warranty claims ballooned far beyond projections. Parts demand overwhelmed suppliers. Dealers requested compensation IH couldn't afford to provide. As revenue declined, the company's already fragile financial foundation, strained by years of ambitious expansions, labor disputes, and rising manufacturing costs, began to buckle. Executives who once believed they could manage the crisis with messaging and denial were forced to face a painful truth. No corporation, no matter how iconic, can survive after losing the trust of the people it relies on most. The DT-466 issue didn't appear as a single catastrophic hit on financial statements. It spread like a slow poison, eroding brand value, shrinking market share, damaging dealer relationships, and driving loyal customers toward competitors waiting for an opportunity. It wasn't just the cost of fixing engines that hurt International Harvester. It was the cost of losing a generation of farmers, many of whom would never again buy Red equipment after being blamed for failures they didn't cause. The collapse of trust soon became a collapse in momentum, and in the machinery world, momentum often means survival. By the early 1980s, IH had entered a financial downward spiral accelerated not only by market pressures and mismanagement, but by the lingering aftershocks of an engine that had promised much and delivered far too little. When the company finally reached the point where survival required selling off its entire agricultural division, many in the Farm Belt understood something executives had long tried to deny. The DT-466 didn't just fail mechanically, it cracked the foundation of confidence that had sustained International Harvester for nearly a century. In the end, the engine that was meant to save IH in the horsepower war helped accelerate its downfall. One flaw, multiplied by denial and amplified by farmers who refused to be ignored, revealed a truth no company can escape. Once trust collapses, everything built upon it eventually follows.